Good evening. I'm Mike Betcher, and welcome to Gaylord College at the University of Oklahoma. Tonight we are continuing our President's Dream Course series, Journalism Under Siege. Earlier on in the semester and at our various classes, we've talked about many threats facing journalism. We've talked about physical threats, journalists killed trying to tell the story. We've talked about verbal threats and political threats as people try to undermine journalism, and it's important to our democracy. We've talked about threats from foreign governments, but tonight we're going to talk about a threat that I believe is the toughest one to face of all, and that revolves around money. How do we survive in a business in this digital age when so many small newspapers and big newspapers are closing down? Television stations are facing problems. Networks are contracting. So what do we do in this digital age? How do we make money? That is the theme of tonight's course, the future of journalism. And we have two fantastic guests who are, for my money, the best in the country to talk about this. First, I want to introduce one of the best Oklahoma newspapermen to ever come out of this state, Joe Haidt, who's a friend of mine. He's currently a professor at the University of Central Oklahoma, but he was a legendary newspaperman at the Oklahoman for 27 years, including managing editor at the Oklahoman. Then in 2012, he decided, well, he wanted to try another newspaper. So he went to the Colorado Gazette. By 2013, his reporting team had won a Pulitzer Prize, and he then said, been there, done that, I got a Pulitzer, I'm coming back to God's country, Oklahoma. And he's back here now teaching ethics at the University of Central Oklahoma. He also runs the Oklahoma Journalism Hall of Fame, of which he is a member, inducted in 2012. Everyone welcome Joe Haidt. Our next guest has come a long ways to be here with us in Norman, Oklahoma. Josh Benton. He's the director of the Nieman Journalism Lab at Harvard University. Josh had an illustrious 10-year career in newspapers, mostly at the Dallas Morning News. He wrote a very much acclaimed series on cheating and standardized test scores. I know none of you would ever do that, but cheating and standardized test scores in Texas public schools, which created a lot of upheaval and change, and one school district closed down, for example. In 28, Josh did something I wish I could have done, which was be a Nieman Fellow. Take a year off, basically.
They wouldn't describe it that way, but
yes. Yeah.
A year to engage in
I mean, a year off from the business,
yes.
Not taking a year off,
yes.
Not on a beach, but you have great support to work on a great journalism project. And, you know, Josh is one of these people who saw it coming, I believe. In 1994, he wrote his first HTML. So he was a person who was always ahead of the curve, and now in his new job, director of he is in now director of the Nieman Journalism Lab. He looks at the future of journalism, where we should be going, what's working and what's not working. As Josh describes it, the lab is 85% newsroom and 15% think tank. So, Josh, let's welcome Josh to Gaylord College.
Thank you.
So what I'm going to ask you to do is let's drop the 85% newsroom and go to the 15% think tank.
Fair enough, yes.
And we're going to change it up a little bit. Instead of starting off with a question and answer period and me talking to our guests, Josh is going to make a presentation here and talk about, as he sees it, where we're going, what's not working, what is working. So everyone, Josh Benton.
Thank you. All right. Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone has had a wonderful Oklahoma day. I'm really thankful for the hospitality that everyone has shown in the last 24 hours or so that I've been here. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to go through what I see as the major trends that are affecting the journalism business going forward. And the framing that I'm using is thinking about 5 years from now. 5 years doesn't seem like that long of a time, but think about 5 years ago. It was a pretty different landscape in terms of digital media. So thinking ahead to what we're going to be seeing soon. And whenever I give a talk about the future of news, I always think of two dials, a hope dial and a panic dial. and which one to tune up a little bit more, because there are certainly very big reasons for concern about the future direction of our business. But I'm hoping we'd have at least a little bit of hope here and there. The core argument that I would make, and that I think is core to anyone who's interested in journalism, is that for a city or a state or a country to thrive, it needs a civically minded, institutionally forceful media. Now, that's not all media. There's nothing wrong with all other types, but to have an institution that can have a powerful impact on society, that can have the interest of the community at heart. Those are both very important things. And unfortunately, there are a lot of economic and other disruptive forces that are currently arrayed against that core truth. So let's look ahead to 2022. I've included some Prozac on this slide if any of you need to deal with the depressing things I'll be talking about. And I'm going to very quickly run through what I think are the 7 big questions that we'll be asking over the next few years. And I'll go through these in turn, but how much will be left in print? Will tech companies control everything? Will digital advertising still support news? I guess it's arguable if it does support news right now. What comes after the mobile phone? What will be left in local news? The future of broadcast? And of course, our president and fake news. So let's start at the beginning. How much will be left in print? As you heard, I worked in newspapers. I was editor-in-chief of my high school newspaper and then editor-in-chief of my college newspaper, and thought I'd have a good long career in the print medium, but that didn't turn out to be the case. This is how a typical American newspaper spent its money before the web came along. You can see on the left side a variety of forces, including the 14% share that went to the newsroom, editorial. People don't often realize that a typical American newspaper only spent 10 to 15% of its money hiring and paying for reporters and editors and photographers. On the right side of that pie chart, you'll see production, distribution, and raw materials. In other words, buying ink by the barrel, buying trees in Canada and turning them into paper, putting fuel into the trucks that deliver the paper every day. There were some publishers of newspapers who saw this chart and saw the coming of the internet and thought, hey, this is great. We can get rid of the right half of our cost structure. The internet essentially solves the problem of distribution, or at the very least renders it very, very inexpensive compared to owning a printing press. Some folks thought optimistically, well, maybe we can keep our advertising base and our revenue and our relationships with our customers, and maybe this internet thing is going to be okay for us. That did not turn out to be the case. This is what has happened to American advertising revenue in print for newspapers over the last few decades. You can see it goes up quite relatively steadily with a fair number of waves. Newspaper business was always particularly susceptible to upturns and downturns in the economy, since advertising budgets go up and down accordingly. But a pretty steady rise up until about 2000, the dot-com bust shortly thereafter, and then the roller coaster hits around 2005, 2006. And you'll see 2 lines there. One is the blue line, which is just print advertising. The red line is print plus digital advertising. And you'll notice that they're pretty much the same line. There's not a lot of difference between the two of them. The money did not, advertising money did not stay with newspapers, and instead found more efficient places to be spent online. One thing you'll notice from this chart is that after the sharp decline during the financial crisis, there was a little bit of a leveling out. The plummeting didn't go at quite the same velocity. That happened for a few years when we had 7% declines, 8% declines annually in print advertising. That has accelerated. These are numbers from Q2 of this year of some of the major chains. You see that they were generally in the 15% range of declines. The New York Times just reported its 3rd quarter print advertising numbers down 20% year over year. And we've seen a reacceleration. In other words, print advertising is getting worse at a faster rate now than it used to be. And just to be honest, I don't really see that changing anytime soon. So the result of that has not been the closure of lots of American newspapers. That was what a lot of people feared 10 years or so ago when they saw the Rocky Mountain News close or they saw the Seattle Post-Intelligencer close. What instead has happened is not the closure of newspapers, but the shrinkage of just about every American newspaper at a very significant level. 2007, there are 55,000 employees in American newspaper newsrooms. 2015, 32,000. The organization that puts this together did not want to put out a 2016 number because they thought it was too depressing. So what's happening now? Are we finally going to get to the point where newspaper closures become a bigger thing, beyond just shrinking another 10% every year? Well, we're seeing things that look a lot like closures that are sometimes disguised in other areas. These are two newspapers in the Bay Area, the Oakland Tribune, the Contra Costa Times. These are both sizable newspapers, circulation of over 200,000 daily. They don't exist anymore because they've been merged into a single paper, the East Bay Tribune. There are a number of other places where multiple newspapers are being merged together in a way that would not have made sense before the web came along. In my home state of Louisiana, Gannett owns 5 newspapers. They're not near each other. It takes about 8 hours to drive from all 5 of them, from Shreveport down to Lafayette to Opelousas, Monroe. But they share a common publisher. They share a common president. Essentially, the back office shops of all these newspapers has been abstracted out. These newspapers are now laid out and copy edited in Kentucky, because that is where Gannett has a design center that does all that work. What you've essentially seen is these newspapers go from being freestanding and somewhat substantial entities to being just enough of a localization of a statewide or national product to enable a local masthead to be put on them. And then there's the case of the Tampa Tribune. Now, the Tampa Tribune shut down last year after 100 plus years of publishing in Florida. In one sense, it's not a new story. Tampa St. Pete was a 2-newspaper metro area, and one of the newspapers closed. 2 newspaper towns becoming 1 newspaper towns is an age-old phenomenon we've seen in this country. But the way the Tribune died was, I think, somewhat unique, because it showed that we're increasingly seeing newspapers that are not owned by people who care about newspapers at all. A company called Revolution Capital, a private equity firm, purchased the Tampa Tribune a few years ago for $9.5 million. Now, $9.5 million is a lot of money, but it's a very cheap price for a major metro newspaper. They did what private equity firms often do. They cut staff from over 600 employees to just over 200 employees within the span of a few years. They realized that the most valuable asset that the Tampa Tribune owned was the land that the newsroom was sitting on. They sold that land to a condo developer for $17.7 million. They've already made a nice profit. Then they shrunk the paper down till it was almost nothing, and then they got paid by the rival paper to shut it down. In other words, this was the financialization of the American press. This was not a newspaper family or even a newspaper chain that had any sort of attachment to journalism. It was a private equity firm that was seeking to suck whatever value it could out of an institution as it's spiraling down. This is the concern that I have for a lot of American newspapers, that they're going to be owned by people who don't particularly care about their community or the civic role of a newspaper. So takeaways from print. It's depressing to note for those of us who have worked at newspapers and who love newspapers, but it is, I think, incontrovertibly true that print still has a long way to fall. Newspapers are going to continue to shrink. There is not a leveling off. Things are going to get worse. In particular, metro newspapers are the hardest hit, which has been the case for the last decade, but local newspapers are starting to feel that pain as well. One thing that's really impacting them is the decline of retail. Their advertisers are no longer local companies. If you're ordering all your things through Amazon, Amazon isn't putting an ad in your local paper. And I think we can expect more of what, to be honest, I thought we'd already have seen more of, the kind of clustering that I discussed earlier and day cutting. No newspaper in America makes money on Mondays. Mondays are just not a day when there are a lot of ads. It's not a particularly sellable product. In other countries, you've seen newspapers stop printing on Mondays or stop printing on Tuesdays. That's been tried in a few markets in the US, but I think we're going to see more of it. Number 2, will technology companies control everything? So if you are a newspaper or a television station or a radio station, if you're a publisher or broadcaster, your audience is for the most part an undifferentiated crowd. You know, the Boston Globe knows where its subscribers live because they have to deliver the paper there. They have a general sense that they're probably interested in something about Boston. They probably are Red Sox fans, right? But there's no specific level of knowledge. They don't know if a particular household only reads the business section or jumps straight to the comics or dives deep into every investigative series. Now, who has a lot of data about their audience? This gentleman, Mark Zuckerberg, has an awful lot. And what we've really seen is the incredible dominance and triumph of the duopoly, Facebook and Google. Think about what Facebook knows about you. They know who you know, where you lived, what content you like, what you buy, where you shop, what ads you respond to. Google knows everything you've ever searched for. If you use Gmail, they know everything you've ever emailed. If you use Google Maps, they know every place you've searched for. They're tracking the locations on your phone. If you have an Android phone, they know the apps that are on your phone, who you chat with in GChat or Hangouts, the videos you watch on YouTube, and they have all this information about you across devices and across years. That is an enormously powerful set of data that gives those two companies an incredible edge. So today in America, the average American spends 50 minutes a day, 50, using Facebook products. There aren't a lot of things that I do 50 minutes a day at all, beyond sleeping, eating, and going to work. That's an incredible dominance of America's time. This is traffic to major American news organization sites, the sources of external traffic. In other words, what are the sites that people click on to go read a story at the New York Times or the Guardian or the Atlantic and so on. And you can see that consistently about 80% of all traffic to these sites comes from either Google or Facebook. You can see down here at the very bottom, Yahoo and Twitter are very distant third and fourth place. This is a slide that Mark Zuckerberg put up at the F8 developer conference last year that was sort of outlining the broader long-term strategy. You have the base product of Facebook, you have the things that have been added on to that, Messenger, WhatsApp, Instagram, and then you get into things like virtual reality, augmented reality, the Oculus Rift, artificial intelligence, computer vision, computer language, a variety of other skills. And then at the top, you may notice there's an item for lasers. He's never explained what the lasers are for. That's what gives me a little bit of pause, what plans he has for the lasers. In 2008, there was a story in the New York Times that I don't think people thought people would be quoting it a decade later, but this line has been cited many times. It was a focus group when a college student said, "If the news is that important, it will find me." Think about how news consumption happened before the web. It was ritualized. You sat down and got the morning paper and read it the same time every day. You watched the newscast in the evening at the same time. Now news is something that seeps its way into your life at irregular times. And that's a shift that really gives power that used to belong to the publishers to the platforms. So as you can see here in the chart on the left, television has for a long time, for many, many years, been the dominant way that Americans get their news. This has changed from 2016 on the left, 2017, just a one-year span. And you can see that the gap between television and online went from 19 points to just 7 points in 1 year's time. And a lot of that is being fueled by older people who are increasingly using social media as news sources. And this enormous amount of data and this enormous amount of attention that Google and Facebook have has enabled them to make an enormous amount of money. As of the first quarter of 2016, of every new dollar spent in digital advertising in the US, 85% of it went to Google or Facebook. By a year later, by the first quarter of 2017, it was 99%. And as of third quarter of this year, if you take Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, and Snapchat, 5 companies that produce essentially no original content, but instead are platforms for the distribution of content, they collectively got 102.6% of all digital ad growth. That may seem impossible, but that means that everyone else is shrinking 2.6% over that same period of time. So how have publishers responded to this? On one hand, they've leaned into distributed content, things like Facebook Instant Articles, Google Accelerated Mobile Pages Project, Apple News. These are platforms in which the technology companies say, hey, it's nice that you have a website, but we really should be publishing directly inside our platform. And hey, we'll even sell the ads for you, and you'll get a cut of it. A variety of publishers have really leaned into this. The Washington Post is very committed to this sort of distribution. Others, like the New York Times, have become a little bit more wary and wanting to control their relationship a bit more. This is one site, The Verge, which is a technology site that writes about gadgets and technology and science. This is data from 2015 and 2016 showing where all the content that is viewed from The Verge is actually seen. As you can see in 2015, that giant blue bar is what we would think of as a traditional visit to a website, someone going to theverge.com and reading an article. A year later, that amount, the number of visits through that context has actually gone down a little bit. But these other bars that you see here are video views on YouTube, views inside Apple News, instant article views inside Facebook, Instagram and Twitter video views. This incredible distribution of content to other platforms. And this is the debate that's going on in the industry right now. On one hand, you get access to enormous scale you otherwise would not by using these technology companies. On the other hand, you're essentially making a business deal that you're always on the losing side of. So now Facebook has the power to say, you know what, we would like everyone to do a lot of Facebook Live videos, and publishers say, yes, sir, and they go about and do it. Just in the last few months, Facebook has decided they're really interested in competing with YouTube, so they're now spending up to $1 billion convincing publishers to produce original TV-like or YouTube-like shows for Facebook Watch. This kind of market power is extraordinary, and that's only to talk about the business piece of it. That doesn't even get into issues around, say, censorship and the control of the flow of information. This is the editor of the largest newspaper in Norway, Aftenposten. His paper put on their Facebook page this very famous photo of the girl being napalmed in the Vietnam War. Facebook then determined that this was child pornography and shut down the newspaper's site on Facebook. They did so for 24 hours. It took the Prime Minister of Norway piping up to say, hey, maybe this is not okay. I don't think that Facebook meant anything wrong by doing that, but nonetheless, the fact that an unelected corporation has that much control over the flow of information worldwide is more than a little bit frightening to me. So takeaways here, if you're a publisher, you want to have a direct path to your consumer. To the extent that you have to go through Facebook or go through another technology company, that is a weakness. Putting public pressure on platforms helps. We'll talk about fake news a little bit later, but the fact that there has been a blowback to Facebook around that topic has actually been useful in getting Facebook to try and change a bit. And I have to say, I don't know where antitrust regulators are when they're letting things happen like Facebook buying Instagram or buying WhatsApp, extending their market powers in ways that seem to be taking advantage of its monopoly over the social graph. Next up, will digital advertising still support news? Here's that same chart I showed you earlier, but with 2 extra lines on it. That's Google's revenue in pink and Facebook's revenue in green. You can sort of see they're moving in opposite directions. This was a slide at a media conference last year that has stuck with me. For media CEOs, there are 2 fundamental questions. How is the media landscape changing? And does digital advertising even work? Is it something that publishers should be counting on, that journalists should be counting on? Back in 1963, David Ogilvy, think Mad Men, grand old man of the advertising business, had a preview of what we now would call native advertising or sponsored content. There's no need for advertisements to look like advertisements. If you make them look like editorial pages, you'll attract about 50% more readers. You might think the public would resent this trick, but there's no evidence to suggest that they do. This is something that all the major elite brands of the news world have leaned into. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, CNN, they're all willing to create content that looks a lot like a story, but is actually advertising, taking advantage of their brand equity. So this, for example, is a New York Times ad. Now, we are media savvy people. I'm sure that we, being folks at Gaylord or of a certain level of education, might be able to see that the headline typeface is not the same that a New York Times story's headline typeface would be, or that the body copy is in a different font, or that there's a small chevron logo up at top center, or that the URL of this would be paidpost.nytimes.com instead of www.nytimes.com. But I think a lot of people would probably look at that and say, that's an interesting that's a story. You know, it has some cool charts. This is Forbes. Forbes doesn't quite go as far as the New York Times does in differentiating its ads from its content. This is an ad that has the same headline typeface and the same body copy and fundamentally the same look as an article. Unless you see Forbes brand voice connecting marketers to the Forbes audience, if you can interpret what that means. And if you notice the city brand logos there. And then on the extreme end, you have something like BuzzFeed, whose entire business is around native advertising and sponsored content. This looks like any BuzzFeed listicle, but it's actually an ad from Miracle-Gro. You can argue about whether it's really bad that Miracle-Gro is fooling us with this content, but nonetheless, it is crossing a line that might not have been considered crossable before. So those slides that I just showed you from the Times and Forbes and the BuzzFeed were part of an academic study showing these to people and saying, are these an ad or are these real content? And consistently, on nearly every publication we tested, consumers tend to identify native advertising as an article, not as an advertisement. Why would publishers be doing this? They are essentially saying, we know we can't compete with Facebook and Google on data. That's a battle that is lost. What do we have that's unique? We have our brand equity. We can sell to advertisers at a pretty expensive price the right to publish content on our websites attached to our brand. Some people think that's an okay deal. Others aren't quite so sure. So how are publishers reacting to this situation? Two ways are by going back to formats that a lot of people thought were very passé. One is email newsletters. If you went back in time 10 years and said, Josh, email newsletters are going to be a thing in 2015, 16, 17, I would have been a little bit surprised. But email newsletters are a direct-to-consumer connection. You are subscribing to a brand and saying, you have permission to interrupt me every day or every week. And advertising within those newsletters can be powerful and make a lot of money. And it's an incredible statement of loyalty to a specific brand, which is exactly what Facebook is fighting against. A second thing would be podcasts. Another thing that had its moment in the mid-2000s, had faded away a bit, but has definitely made a comeback. In part, again, because you have that direct-to-consumer relationship. Podcast advertising is extremely effective in a whole lot of ways. And what you've seen with the higher-end publications is a recognition that advertising is not the main core of their business. This is a New York Times statement from earlier this year when they're outlining their digital strategy from now until 2020. And the key line here is, we are, in the simplest terms, a subscription-first business. We're not trying to maximize clicks and sell low-margin advertising against them. We're not trying to win a page view arms race. We believe our strategy is provide journalism so strong that several million people are willing to pay for it. Now that has a clarifying effect on the vision, right? That makes it clear what you're trying to do. And the fact that outlets like CNN, CNN.com, the largest news site in the English language in the world, is now going to be putting up paywalls and creating paid digital products. We are seeing this shift away from advertising to reader revenue. And there's a whole lot of benefits to that for publishers, but it does also mean that people who don't want to pay for a lot of different sites are not going to have access to quality news in the same way they do now. We've seen in the United States in the past year a very significant increase in the willingness of Americans to pay for online news. In 1 year's time, we went from 7th out of 9 to 1st out of 9. I suspect Donald Trump might have had a small thing to do with that. So takeaways here, you're not going to build a business on ad network money, on display advertising, rectangles on a screen. It's just a broken model. You cannot build a business that supports an expensive newsroom. You can maybe support a cheap newsroom around cheap content. Reader revenue really is the path forward, and the upside and downside of this is we're moving from mass media to niche media. Next, what comes after this device? After the phone that has really shifted our lives. You've probably already seen this set of images before, but it's worth noting this is when Pope Benedict was selected as the new pope and when Pope Francis was selected as the new pope 8 years later. You might notice there's a slight difference in the content of the images because in that short of a period of time, there was a revolution in the ways that we get our information. Most American and European newsrooms have crossed the majority mobile threshold, meaning they'd get the majority of their audiences on mobile devices now, but they typically only get 10% or less of their digital revenue from those mobile audiences. I want to show you two slides here, one from 2010 and one from 2016. Now the way that this slide works, this is from a presentation by Mary Meeker from Kleiner Perkins. This breaks up the 5 major forms of media, print, radio, TV, internet, and mobile in the United States, and shows 2 data points on each of them. What percentage of Americans' time spent consuming media is spent consuming that type of media, and what percentage of ad dollars go to that form of media. Now there's no ironclad rule that those should be equal, but you would expect over time that if people are spending more time and attention in a given form of media, that ad dollars would follow, right? So the 2 big gaps here are print on the left, which in 2010 was getting 8% of our attention, but was earning 27% of ad dollars. And on the far other side, mobile phones, 2010, relatively soon after the iPhone's debut. We were spending 8% of our time staring at our phones, the same as print, but it was only 0.5% of ad revenue, right? So just keep an eye on print and mobile, and I'm going to show you the next slide, which is these same numbers for 2016. In 6 short years, mobile has gone from being having the same amount of our attention as print to having almost 7 times as much attention as print. We went from having 0.5% of ad dollars to 21% of ad dollars. And you'll notice that if you believe these even out over time, and I think broadly speaking they do, mobile still has a long way to go up, and print still has a long way to go down. Print still gets much more money advertising-wise than its attention would seem to justify. So a lot of people thought when we moved from laptops to phones, we were just going from one screen to a slightly smaller screen. But the paradigm shift has been much more significant because you're trading the open web for a closed app ecosystem. If you are getting the internet on a laptop, you're in a web browser, and nytimes.com lives on the same level as Joe's blog about Sooners.org. Everyone is equal. They're all living on the same open platform, and it's easy to go from page to page. On the phones, people don't access information through the web browser. This is Steve Jobs showing off the iPhone on its first day, and you can see showing off that you can look at a very unmobile-friendly nytimes.com in Safari. But now, smartphone users spend about 6 minutes inside apps for every 1 minute they spend inside Safari or Chrome, their web browser. And that time is completely dominated by two companies. Can you guess what they are? Facebook and Google. These are the 10 most actively used apps in America. 8 of them are owned by Facebook or Google. You'll see Snapchat and Pandora sneaking in there as well. So this shift in power has the saying that people in the news business sometimes say ruefully over beers is we moved from print dollars to digital dimes, and now we're going from digital dimes to mobile pennies. I hate to think what like smartwatch ads will be, like a mill or something. So mobile is at an unusual place that it's a fairly mature form, right? New phones come out every year, and they're not nearly as exciting as they were when a new phone meant a huge increase in speed and usability. So there's a significant amount of interest in figuring out what is going to be the next transformative platform after mobile. And publishers and technology companies are all trying to figure out. One is tied to mobile, but one is the idea of chat applications and chat interfaces. There are a lot of publishers that created Facebook Messenger bots this past year. The thinking there is people do spend an enormous amount of time in their chat apps, talking to their friends, whatever their app of choice is. Maybe publishers can get in there and get some attention. In general, these have all been flops because it turns out people don't want to communicate with CNN the same way they want to communicate with their girlfriend. I will point to this app, which is from Quartz, the Atlantic Media business site. It's an iPhone app that is entirely in a chat interface, and it's actually quite charming. It's the only thing in this form that I think works. If you haven't seen it, check it out. So another idea for what the next transformative technology is the only thing that can convince people to stare into cardboard boxes for extended periods of time, virtual reality. This is the New York Times debut launch of their VR product using Google Cardboard. I confess I'm a bit of a skeptic around the impact of virtual reality in news. Some people think this is within 2 years' time, we're all going to be staring into cardboard boxes to get our morning news. I tend to think that VR is a little bit farther away. The technology is still very clunky and not particularly user-friendly. And when it does evolve, as it certainly will, into something more usable, it will be Hollywood and gaming that leads the way. News will not be a prime mover in that. Then you have voice interfaces like the Amazon Echo. Alexa, tell me what's happening in the world. You know, there are news interfaces to be had there, and there's some excitement around that. It's still a pretty niche device, and it also creates all sorts of questions around discovery. When you go to a web page, you get to see 10 or 15 stories that you might be interested in looking at. With the Echo, the paradigm is the publisher just starts talking to you, and you don't have much of a way of scanning between options. You have smartwatches and other wearable devices. I love my Apple Watch, but I think it hasn't had a particularly large impact on the distribution of news in the world. Good for push notifications, which are sort of the killer app on mobile phones anyway. And then to go a little bit metaphysical, the Apple's AirPods, the wireless headphones that I confess I love almost as much as I love my child. The idea of having a computer in your ear that could be telling you things at appropriate times. You're late for your appointment. There's a big breaking story in Iran. The idea of having that sort of interface as something that fades into the background is potentially interesting, particularly if you think of it in terms of what everyone anticipates from Apple in 2019 or 2020, which is the debut of an augmented reality glasses. You can imagine a space where there is a buzz on your wrist when something's happening, things are whispered into your ear, and you're able to see them through a glasses interface. That seems weird and bizarre, but it seems a lot closer than virtual reality as a significant way that we might have big changes. So we are at this weird point in the growth curve of phones. They've kind of gotten boring. There's a bit of a desire to look at what's next. We do have those new dynamics of push and pull. Are you seeking out stories? Are stories being fed to you? And all the new companies that I just mentioned that could be the next platforms, they're run by companies like Facebook and Amazon and Google. It's still publishers against technology companies in Northern California and maybe Seattle. So what's going to be left in local news? My job for the last 9 years has been to try and figure out where things are going in news, and there are a lot of areas where I have reasons for optimism. Local news, unfortunately, is not really one of them. It's easy to forget that news has always been fundamentally a distribution business. What is the area that an American newspaper is interested in journalistically? It's see how far the trucks can drive in the morning to deliver the paper. That's roughly the area that they're interested in. A TV station is interested in how far its broadcast tower goes. Because the United States is so geographically large, we, unlike the countries of Europe, developed very strong local news organizations. We didn't develop 7 national newspapers like in the UK that have different slices of liberal and conservative and upmarket and downmarket and broadsheet and tabloid. We had, in most cities, for most of the 20th century, 1 or maybe 2 newspapers, and those were your only options. They made an enormous amount of money, and that money was possible because of the distribution advantage they had over everyone else. But when you move to digital, you're essentially giving up the geographic element of distribution, right? There's really no reason online to focus on creating news for Hartford, Connecticut, because the whole point of digital distribution is that anyone can see your story. Why would you want to limit the audience to just people in Hartford, Connecticut? That's why all the places where money has been fed, to Vox and Vice and Business Insider and Mashable and BuzzFeed, they are not interested in geography. They are interested in demographics and psychographics. They are interested in targeting a specific audience, often an upmarket audience, because they'd like to make money. There's been very little interest at any sort of scale in covering local news in a digital environment. I did a little sample last year looking at where journalism jobs are located. If you looked at the jobs that I analyzed, about 8% of the TV jobs were based in New York or DC, about 10% of newspaper jobs were based in New York or DC, but 40% of the digital jobs were based in New York or DC. There's been this incredible sucking out of journalistic resources in the middle of the country and shifting primarily to New York and Washington, to a lesser degree San Francisco, LA, and maybe Miami. There are a number of institutions who are trying to work on figuring out a local news solution. Lion and the Institute for Nonprofit News are leaders in that field. And there are a few startups that are doing interesting things in Charlotte, in Philadelphia, and Miami. They all have the same color scheme for some reason. I've never figured that out. But they are pretty uncommon. And I will say, Billy Penn and the Charlotte Agenda have both laid people off recently, and they are sort of the brightest stars in this constellation. There is a big reason for concern about local news. The incentive structures that encourage local reporting are going away. And that means in some cities, in lucky cities, you might have a broader mix of news sources. If you live in a well-off suburb in northern New Jersey, there are probably 3 good blogs about your town that are probably run by frustrated spouses who wish they were still working at their day job. You might have a public radio station that's investing more in journalism. You might have a local university that sponsors a nonprofit investigative news outfit. If you're lucky, you'll be in a town where there's a mix of things that will take up some of the slack that is left behind from newspapers and television. If you are not lucky, you may just not have any local news. As I said, I'm from a small town in South Louisiana. You have to drive pretty far to find a digital news startup from my house. Increasingly, local news is going to shift from being an incredible profit generator, which is what it was for the 20th century, to being an act of philanthropy by civically minded individuals. And one of the big problems is that there are local success stories in digital, but they are isolated. They are typically the result of a really talented publisher, a really talented editor, people who are very skilled at what they're doing and working very hard. The great thing about the newspaper business model is that it wasn't that hard to make a lot of money. All you had to do was be the only newspaper in town. It was essentially a license to print money. So to the extent that there are solutions, they are very difficult to scale out from community to community. There are still 1,350 daily newspapers in this country, and there's nothing close to replacing them in digital. We are approaching the end, I promise. Will broadcast be as disrupted as print was? As a former newspaperman, I was always jealous of my TV colleagues who continued to make enormous amounts of money long after all my friends were laid off. But let's start with radio. National Public Radio, NPR, is the big Goliath in this space, and they have actually not had significant declines in their overall audience. That's in part because of the aging of the American audience, but they have lost significant numbers among younger people. This is a pattern that you'll see a few times here. The podcasting space is, for my money, maybe the most interesting and exciting space in this world. There are a number of companies that are essentially in a race to replace terrestrial radio, to take over the commutes that people are currently spending listening to All Things Considered or Morning Edition, and shift that into podcasts. The initial successes were around what you might think of as duplicating the weekends of public radio, feature shows, things more in the This American Life vein. But there are now a number of efforts to create daily news podcasts that are maybe competing more directly with, say, Morning Edition. The Daily from the New York Times, NPR has its own version. Vox is going to be creating its own very soon. The big threat for radio in the long term is this little guy, the self-driving car. Radio has an enormous advantage because Americans spend a lot of time driving to and from work. And it's not safe, people, to be watching videos or reading news stories or texting with your friends during that commute. When the car does the driving for you, though, audio loses that advantage. And in the longer term, this is still 5 or 10 years away for the most part, that's going to be a concern for anyone producing audio. Let's talk about TV now very quickly. This should be a terrifying chart to anyone in television. This is 18 to 24-year-olds in the United States, how much time each week they spend watching television. This is the 4 quarters, so they're basically all the same. But if you look, 2011, the average 18 to 24-year-old spent 26.5 hours a week watching television. Now this is watching live television or DVR'd content, so what we think of as traditional television. As of the first quarter of this year, that was down to 14.5 hours. That's almost 2 hours a day that young people have stopped watching television and basically started looking at their phones. That is an enormous threat to television going forward and the business models that have supported television. Audiences in news programs and all programs in broadcast and cable continue to get older and older and older, and the demographically appealing and advertiser appealing audiences are stepping out. You can see that in a number of ways, this is broken down by age 18 to 29 all the way up to 65 plus, and you can see that in markets, online is on the rise and television is on the decline, but in the younger audience, television is essentially already lost. And in 1 year's time, the percentage of 65 plus Americans who get news regularly from online sources increased by 50% in 1 year's time. So there are a number of debates about the future of television. Apple and Amazon and Roku will tell you the future of TV is in apps. If you want ESPN, you will subscribe to an ESPN app, and that will be the level of interaction that you have. An alternate theory is the idea of the skinny bundle. You may have heard about Hulu Live TV, YouTube TV, Sling TV, PlayStation View. These are all folks who are trying to create a streaming version of the cable bundle, gathering together a variety of channels and selling them to you in one big package. Generally speaking, these have not set the world on fire. I think Sling TV is the biggest and has about 1 million paying subscribers. But this is an attempt to try and carry over the incredible financial benefits of the old cable television model to online streaming. The big question for me in this is, if you go from, most people who watch CBS or NBC or ABC, they're not watching it specifically for local news. They're watching it because they wanted to see the dramas and comedies that show up in primetime or the game shows that show up during the day, whatever they're watching. News was a piece of the puzzle, but it was not the dominant piece of the puzzle. But as those comedies and dramas move to Netflix and move to Amazon Prime and move to Hulu and move to other platforms that are not tied to local distribution, how does local news survive that transition? There are lots and lots of young people, I'm sure in this room, who don't watch television as it's traditionally defined, and instead are watching things stream on their laptop screens from Netflix. There's no natural way for local news to fit in there. And a lot of channels, including news channels, that have benefited from being part of a bigger bundle, as that bundle breaks up, those advantages and subsidies go away. Does anyone know what this is a screenshot of? Did anyone watch this in real time? This is something that BuzzFeed did on Facebook Live one afternoon last year, on a Friday afternoon about 3 o'clock. They decided that they were going to test the theory that you could make a watermelon explode by slowly putting rubber band after rubber band after rubber band after rubber band around it. They got it to about 800 rubber bands, and then it did explode. It took 45 minutes to do, and this was all broadcast and streamed live on Facebook Live. This had a bigger audience than anything on American television for its time slot. 14 million people watched this. BuzzFeed is very good at what they do. We have to give them credit for that. They realize a Friday afternoon at 3 p.m. is exactly the right time to distract people at their desks. This was a moment that a lot of people in the broadcast business said, oh, something significant has changed here. Along with that, going back to the power of the platforms, you have folks like this woman at Facebook saying at a conference that Facebook will be all video within 5 years. I'm sure you've already noticed, if you've been using Facebook for a number of years, that video is a much bigger part of the Facebook experience than it used to be. I would give you her exact quote, but she was in a video, so I just needed a screenshot, and text is a much more efficient medium, but whatever. So we now have all these news organizations that are making this giant pivot to video. They are firing all their writers and hiring a bunch of videographers to produce viral video for Facebook. I think this is a dumb move, fundamentally. It's not going to work out for most folks. In part because I think publishers confuse the fact that people really do like video for the fact that they want news video in any significant way in a digital platform. And there's not a lot of evidence for that. This is a study from a number of 30 outlets from the US and Europe showing that on news sites, 6.5% of those sites the pages have a video on them, but users only spend 2.5% of their time on those pages. In other words, having a video on a page makes people run away. Even for brands associated with hard news, their top or second most successful videos in terms of engagement involve animals. And I love animals, I'm sure you love animals, but they're hardly the future of the investigative reporting game. So Facebook is now trying to monetize the enormous video audiences that they have obtained, and it is not working out well. One publisher that is currently in a beta program for mid-roll ads in Facebook had 20 million total views of their videos in September, and they made about $500 for it. Anyone who remembers the television business knows that if you got 20 million viewers, I think you generated more than $500 in revenue. There's this idea that young people just want video, but consistently, across surveys, across polls, young people say they prefer to get their news by reading, and older people say they prefer to get their news by video. It makes a lot of sense when you see how old the television audience is. So there are a lot of publishers who I think are making a bet that they're deeply going to regret. Everyone wants to chase that television money. There's still a huge amount of money in television. There's the idea that it's going to be disrupted at some point. People want to be there to grab that money. You're seeing, in fact, digital outlets now wanting to have cable TV shows because they realize the money isn't moving over as quickly as they would like. And as I said, it's very unclear how news fits into that. Finally, we have reached the final stage. Will we survive Trump and fake news? So I am from this town, Rain, Louisiana, town of about 6,000 people, right in the thick of Cajun country. We are the frog capital of the world. I would encourage you all to come down for the Frog Festival every year. Feel free to rent a frog and go in the frog races. I looked at the mayor of my hometown's Facebook page in the 48 hours before the election. These were all stories that he had shared. Hillary Clinton was calling for civil war. Pope Francis had endorsed Donald Trump. Barack Obama admits he was born in Kenya. FBI agent suspected of leaking Hillary's corruption is dead. That's just the last 48 hours. He also had classics such as Hillary is an actual demon, is an actual spawn of Satan, and a variety of other things that were at the very least racially insensitive. I'll say that. This is the kind of thing that was shared widely among my family and friends down in Louisiana. And it's kind of alarming. Just the Pope Francis story on its own was shared about 1 million times, viewed by, depending on how you estimate it, 10 to 30 million people. And fake news became a thing. It became a thing that you can buy fake news beer now. It also was a term that very quickly got turned away from the uses that it was being used for before November 8th into a cry for any news that someone disagrees with. Just declare it fake news. The Washington Post is fake news. CNN is fake news. If we stick to a more realistic definition of that, I want to show you some of the research that's been done around fake news mostly in the time since the election. This is a study of both the German election and Michigan voters before the presidential election here last fall. And you can see that in the US election in Michigan, Twitter users were sharing roughly as much fake news as they were professionally produced news content. This is analysis done out of Stanford that looked at 115 pro-Trump fake stories that were shared a total of 30 million times. Their estimate was that just in that subset of stories, and that is a small subset of the overall fake news issue, 760 million instances of a user clicking through to read a fake news story. And they estimate that the average adult saw and remembered 1.14 fake stories. Now that's the average. There are a lot of people who saw 0, and there are a lot of people who saw a lot. So Americans now say, 64% say that fake news has left Americans confused about basic facts. There has been a long-standing debate, as long as social media has been around a concept called the filter bubble. This is the idea that if you're a conservative or you're a liberal, if you have a particular point of view, your friends on social media are likely to share your point of view. And that means that you're likely to just get more information that reinforces your existing point of view and not information that challenges it. And I confess I was always a little bit of the skeptic of this argument. There are a few reasons. One is that there's actually been research to show that your Facebook friends are more ideologically diverse than the people you talk to every day in real life, right? Your Facebook friends include the people you went to college with, but also the people you went to middle school with, and also your crazy aunt and a whole set of other people, right? So that is, I lived until recently in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I would have had to walk a long way to randomly bump into a Trump voter anywhere in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I can assure you. So I was a little bit skeptical about this impact, but what I think fake news and hyper-partisan news really do is they convert, low-grade 70s marijuana into really pure heroin. Because what you really have is you've shifted from a world where if you're a conservative, you might be more likely to see stories from the National Review, or if you're a liberal, you might be more likely to see more stories from The Nation, to if on either side, you're likely to be shown things that are simply not true, that are created by people whose desire is to create false propaganda, either to make money or to shift a political argument. That is a weaponization of that space, which I think has really changed the tenor of social media. Now, why do people create fake news? As far as we can tell, the most important reason for most people is they want to make money. Back in the old days, before the web, if you wanted to run a publication or you wanted to run a broadcast outlet, you were both in charge of providing the content and selling the ads. You had to have relationships on both sides. And that provided something of a damper on how crazy you could get. If you were putting out crazy content that was libeling people, the advertisers didn't want to be associated with it. Online, the way you sell ads is you essentially put 3 lines of code on your site and you let Google sell the ads for you. There's no relationship between the advertiser and the publisher. And that has meant that the incentive structure is to share the wildest, craziest stuff that gets people's emotions inflamed, so they will share them with their networks. You may have heard in a lot of the fake news in the past election was coming out of Macedonia. There's one particular town of Veles, Macedonia. This was the center of the fake news world. Hundreds of fake news sites run out of this town by people who, as far as we can tell, were just people who realized they could make ad dollars and make a few $100s a month writing terrible things. The folks who are doing this for a business often don't really have any particular political story to advance. One innovation in the space in recent times has been folks who run conservative and liberal versions of the same fake news stories. They just slightly tweak the headline, so they figure they could take advantage of rage on all sides. And what we've seen is a shift away from the creation of what we might term mainstream or non-ideologically oriented media towards a real favoring of both left and right-leaning media. That is what works online. Remember, we're shifting from mass media to niche media, and reporting it down the middle and focusing on a very newspapery model of objectivity doesn't hit the numbers in quite the same way. So if you look at Facebook, if you look at the emoji responses, other than the like button, you have a variety of choices. By far, the most popular reaction on a news story is beyond the like, is the heart. It's love. It's a beautiful emotion. The exception to that is stories about politics, where the angry emoji is the #1 response. And what we've seen, this chart I think says a lot about where we are with fake news. This is a start from 1972 to 2012, asking people 2 questions. The black line at the bottom is asking people, think about your own political views. How far do you think your party's political views are from your political views. So if you're a Republican, how far do you think the Republican point of view is from your own? You'll note that that is a low number and has been pretty consistent over time. The other line is how far do you think the other party is from your views? So if you're a Republican, how far are the Democrats? If you're a Democrat, how far are the Republicans? And you see that has gone nowhere but up. This is the phenomenon of negative partisanship. It's not that people feel stronger attachment to their party, it's that they hate the other guys. And that is what fake news fuels. This is maybe my favorite chart of all time. This is asking a question in 1960 and 2008 to Democrats and Republicans, asking them, if your son or daughter came home and said, Dad, I want to marry Jimmy, and he's a Republican, and you're a Democrat, how angry are you? Back in 1960, a very small number of Democrats and Republicans said they would be angry. By 2008, over a quarter of Republicans and about a fifth of Democrats say, I am really upset that you are thinking about doing this. Again, negative polarization. So Facebook has tried a variety of things to try and deal with this. Facebook is by far the biggest vector by which fake news is spread. They've started adding disputed tags to stories when they have been flagged by multiple fact-checking organizations. But this is, I think it's fair to say, been quite ineffective. The organizations are only checking a little less than 100 stories a month. I can assure you there are more than 100 fake news stories per month. And there's actually been some new research out of Yale that indicates that because some stories now show up as flagged, Facebook users are now more likely to believe fake news stories that aren't flagged because they think someone is checking and this hasn't been flagged. So they think, oh, okay, yeah, I didn't expect the Pope to endorse Trump, but I guess that's what he did. So now we're at a point where the cries of fake news, both the real cries about real fake news and the political use of fake news as an epithet, have led to studies like this. 27% of Americans think that traditional major news sources regularly report fake news stories. That's absurd. And a sign of the deep ways in which mistrust has been allowed to enter those relationships. Another survey from earlier this year asking people what percentage of the news on your Facebook feed do you believe to be fake news? The median response was 48%. People think that half of what is put in front of them is fake. There's a lot of fake news, but it's not half of everyone's news feeds. This incredible environment of mistrust. This is interesting data from an Oxford University study asking people who avoid news why they avoid news. And overwhelmingly, people on the left in the United States say, I avoid news because it can have a negative effect on my mood. I think a number of liberals have been there recently. People on the right say they don't take in news because they can't rely on it to be true. This is a unique American phenomenon. Compare the US and the UK on the question of trust in the news by political allegiance. In the US, it's much closer, and actually people on the right have more trust of media than people on the left. We have this unusual phenomenon that you can see in these three charts from the UK, Germany, and the US. Now this is, each dot there, each circle, represents a news organization. And the news organization, the circle is not saying that the news organization is liberal or conservative. It's measuring the audience of the news organization, right? You'll notice that the audience of Fox News is right of center. That's not really surprising to anybody. But what is kind of astonishing is that the audiences of just about every major news organization in the country are significantly left of center, despite the fact that surveys continually say that conservatives are more numerous in the United States than self-proclaimed liberals. Liberals far overconsume news, and that is the only way that you see that sort of a maldistribution, which just doesn't exist in other countries. So we have phenomenon like I mentioned earlier that people are more willing to pay for online news now. Well, that is a consistently liberal phenomenon. 29% of liberals, but only 11% of conservatives are willing to pay for online news as of this past year, a gap that has grown. This is the amount of trust that Americans have in their news. Rather than being up there with Finland, you know, everyone wants to be with Finland and everything, right? They always at the top of everything. We're down there with Hungary. I mean no slight to the Hungarians, but maybe that's not where we want to be. So this is part of a broader trend about increasing distrust in institutions everywhere, and media institutions and other institutions. This is Gallup surveys for every year. You can see the decline in trust in media year over year. There's actually an interesting story from this year in that there was, for the first time in a while, a significant increase in the number of Americans who say that they trust the media. But there's a depressing angle to that too, because if you break it down, it's really just Democrats who trust the media more. They've had an enormous spike, and Republicans are still not trusting the media at all. The struggle that we have at this point is to realize that the internet is fundamentally an engine for the creation of mistrust. There were very utopian visions about the internet, that they were going to let everyone have a voice in the grand debate of democracy. There was no longer going to be a choke point and filter, that it wasn't just one editor in one city that could determine what news reached an audience. And a lot of that is completely true. But at the same time, it has also enabled an environment where nothing has to be true, because there is no institution that you trust that is telling you it is true. It is very easy to live in your own information universe at this point. And our president hasn't really helped on that by his consistent claiming that the media is an enemy of the American people, and that we need to change the libel laws to get some charges against news organizations printing things he disagrees with. This has been good for the New York Times. The New York Times has gained 1 million digital paying subscribers in the past year. Good for the New York Times. Trump has been nothing but good for them. But we are increasingly seeing a world where there is that elite audience that is willing to and able to pay for news and sees it as an important part of their civic responsibility, and a larger group of people who don't have access or don't have interest in pursuing quality news. So on one hand, the issues of trust and fake news are ancient. There have been hoaxes for as long as there has been a media. On the other hand, the new distribution means, primarily Facebook, means that those bits of false information can reach vastly huger audiences very quickly. And the one piece of advice I would offer is that news organizations have traditionally had a sense of Olympian distance from their audiences. They are standing above it all. But as trust in institutions has declined, trust in actual human beings hasn't declined at anywhere like the same rate. And the more that news organizations can communicate that actual human beings are involved in the creation of journalism, the better off they'll be. So, is there any hope at all? Should we all just, walk out of here and find a bridge and walk off it? I don't think so. Go back to what I said at the very beginning. We need a civically minded, institutionally forceful media. There are a variety of outlets. I won't go into all of them because I've already yammered on for too long, but there are a number of outlets that are doing interesting and compelling things around membership, around creating targeted local experiences, around doing great investigative journalism that is supported by a community, is supported by the crowd, creating premium products which can aim at a particular audience, but letting some of their positive journalistic work drift out into the mainstream. There's a lot of interesting work going on. But I do think that the broader trends are pretty clear. If you want to make money in the news business right now, you have to target a high-value audience with a high-value product. My inner small d Democrat hates that idea, because I really don't like the idea that the way to make money in news is targeting rich people or information-rich people or industries that have particular incentives to gather information. The way forward is focusing on reader payment. Advertising is, in the vast majority of cases, not going to be an engine going forward. If you can, don't be reliant on platforms. And aim for the logged in user. In other words, if the New York Times really wants you to log in, they will offer you services that require you to log in, not because they care much about those services, but because when you're logged in, you are giving them more data that gives them the better ability to target advertising or content at you. The things that aren't working, thinking in terms of mass media. Unless you are venture capital funded and able to work on a very large scale, that's not a game you can play anymore. And to be driven by digital ads, that's just not going to be a business anymore. So that is my vision, some good, some bad, for 2022, and I'd love to talk about it with the rest of you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm looking for, no, that's right, I'm just looking for the liquor cabinet. I'm going to start.
There is a reception afterwards.
I'm going to start drinking again.
On the About page of Neiman Lab, I say we are fundamentally optimistic of the future. I wrote that in 2008. I always think about, should I take that off?
Thank you. Well, Joe. Go ahead. The table's fine. So let me take you to what I think was a really interesting year for you, 2012. You're inducted into the Oklahoma Journalism Hall of Fame. You are there at the top at the Oklahoman, and you decide to go to the Colorado Springs Gazette. You're in one newsroom having these discussions about things that you saw here, and you go to another newsroom. Were they having the same discussions? Was there hope then? Did you see and follow the track that he's laid out here, that Josh has told us?
Well, I think we started to experiment at the Oklahoman mainly under the dean of this college. He really spearheaded thinking and innovating and experimenting, and so I had the opportunity to go to a lot of different conferences, where it was predicted the last newspaper would be produced in the year 2075, and then it started going down and down and down, and but I think that I have always, even though my base is a newspaper, the foundation, I love that foundation, I never considered myself a per se newspaper man, because I always considered myself a journalist, and a journalist first looks for different avenues to think about how they can convey information, okay? And I see this as kind of exciting that there's so many different avenues that you have now to present information. It's a challenge too because of the fragmenting markets, but it's exciting in a way too, and I think it only will continue to be exciting and challenging at the same time. And I think challenging to me is something that we really have to think about. What are the challenges ahead as you put the year 2022 as well? But my question this is, and I have to say, I teach media ethics, which of course everybody says we definitely need these days and things like that. But when I decided today, and we're talking about economics and ethics and how to make money but with credibility, so I showed them a video that you did, I think in Korea. I think it was in 2015.
Sounds right.
And you had a lot of interesting information and things like that. And at the end of the YouTube video, I asked them, well, what do you think? What do you think about all this? And there was silence. And and finally I pushed them, well, what do you really think about all this? And they go, well, I think we have to think. One student raised his hand and said, well, I have to think about it because you've really overwhelmed me with information here. And I think that's what, I think it's very interesting what you're saying, but I think that we're getting overwhelmed with this information, and that's part of the challenge is deciphering that information about what is most useful to us. What is most useful? And I take, in a simplistic way, my habit, my wife's habit every morning is something that we have to think about. My habit is to go out in the driveway and pick up that newspaper. It's, it's there with several other newspapers. I go through them, and then I go to my digital device. Her reaction is get up, get my cup of coffee, get my iPad. I go to Facebook. Mm-hmm. And you know what she does? Every once in a while she bothers me because she plays the videos too loud. and it's in the morning. I haven't had all my coffee yet or anything like that. But every once in a while she'll say something to me, and she'll turn around and say, Joe, is this real? And the question is, and the question I have of you is, can credibility make money?
I think it is a key part of the recipe for, at the very least, what we might think of as premium publishers going forward. The idea of a trusted source, and a source that a reader and a customer has a direct relationship with, is incredibly powerful. And what I think we have seen in recent years is that people are increasingly willing to pay for that. Not everyone, but a small number. But it's a real number that you can build a business around. And I do think that when you look at, say, all the ways that the New York Times and the Washington Post have diversified the ways in which they deliver information through infographics and videos and interactive experiences, and as well as traditional news stories, as well as something that is of a bloggier, webbier tone, all those formats, they tend towards exposing the workings of the journalism a little bit more. you can see that someone is updating that live blog on a regular basis. And creating that direct connection with an individual reporter or an individual columnist is, I think, a very powerful way for people to feel that. And there are certainly a lot of people who are, as we saw in the data I showed, who are very confused about the information that they see, particularly on social media. And if I'm a publisher, I think that is something I want to lean into and say, look, you can trust us.
Well, and I think there's a survey that I'll point to. I think it's just recently released from a media research firm called Kantar. Have you heard of that? Mm-hmm. And they recently released a survey called Trust in the News. And basically what they did is they surveyed 8,000 news consumers in the U.S., UK, France, and Brazil. And I think it's interesting what the key findings of this survey is. Traditional print and broadcast media brands have proven more resilient to accusations of fake news than social media platforms and digital news outlets. News consumers are reading more widely and becoming more sophisticated in their engagement with news content, for example, by independently fact-checking news they read. The public believes fake news has an impact on recent elections, but maintain that quality journalism is important for democracy. The question is, what will quality news be in the future?
And will people not just say that they want it, but take action?
Exactly. Will they pay for it?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the big story. So again, will credibility sell? I personally believe it will. I hope it will.
Well, tell us a little bit about the Pulitzer Prize-winning series that the Colorado Springs Gazette did. Was it worth the investment? Tell us about the series, and was it worth that investment? Did you get that quality journalism? It won a Pulitzer. Did you get bang for the buck?
Well, actually, we did, and we found that it was a data-driven project called Other Than Honorable, and it was a story that Dave Phillips, who's now with the New York Times, spearheaded with a group of journalists in the newsroom, and basically it was about veterans who were getting kicked out after serving multiple deployments when they started suffering from PTSD and also traumatic brain injury. And basically they were being thrown out of the Army without benefits. And we were finding, and you'll find this not only in this state but across the country, and we were particularly finding in Colorado Springs a lot of homeless vets who had some form of PTSD or traumatic brain injury who ended up in the emergency room with no benefits, no way to seek help or anything like that. So with this data-driven project and the training I'd received at Oklahoma, we turned it into a multimedia type of project that had video and hired an online developer to make the online presentation the best way possible. It had a print component, had all these components except maybe a podcast component. Maybe I forgot that. I don't know.
Podcasts weren't big back then.
Yeah, but we were finding that we were getting thousands and thousands of shares on Facebook, and time spent on site, with the stories was like 5 to 6 minutes, when the average is like 10 to 15 seconds.
Yeah.
And so we were getting that type of data showing that investigative projects, data-driven projects, such as Other Than Honorable, were getting these types of pushback. But again, it still deals with the fact that you have other people saying, well, you need page views, you need those clicks. And I'm going, well, you need time spent on site too, don't you? And so that continues to be a pressure, I think, in the newsrooms, not only in print, but in broadcast, is clicks versus time and how valuable that is as well. But the biggest compliment I got was when the Sid Gisler, who's the Pulitzer administrator, called me after we'd entered it, and he said, I got a question for you. Is this a print entry or is it an online entry? And I thought, you just gave me the biggest compliment of all. And I told him it was an online entry.
Well, this brings up a point then, because this story, this series centered on a community. And in national news, we kept chasing demographic community. In local news, we're chasing a geographic community. maybe we should be producing for interest communities. I mean, is that what we should be doing? Because it sounds like that's what you did.
Yeah.
If you look at, you have less than 1% of the American public in uniform, but 8% have served. That's a veterans community, and then you spread that out among families and friends of those. There was huge interest, apparently, in those interest communities. And
Well,
should we be chasing interests rather than
in a way
demographic?
we might, but remember, local stories can have national impact. And when you start finding a local story like that, you have to understand, and that's what I started pushing Dave more than anything else. This is a national story, Dave. This is not just a local story. There are veterans being affected like this all over the country. And he started finding statistics such serving that Fort Sill, which is in Oklahoma, Fort Bragg, all these other places were had the same type of attitude toward these types of veterans. They were kicking them out without benefits as well. So a seriously local story then became a national story because the mindset was, this is a story that would have that type of interest. So, and the question I have to you is, can local news survive in that respect?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right that some of the best stories of the last decade or two have come from local stories that discover a national reach. And there are a lot of stories that need to be first discovered in a community, meeting a veteran, a homeless veteran, and seeing that story and then being able to spread out from there. I mean, the test cheating stories that I did that you mentioned started in one school, then it spread out to one school district, then it spread out to the state. And one of the real challenges is that even though the New York Times and the Washington Post and other national outlets have a brighter future and are investing in doing a lot of great investigative work, you see the world differently from Manhattan than you do from Colorado Springs or from Oklahoma City or from somewhere else. And to the extent that it is a top-down view, there's still a ton of great work that can be done, but you're going to be missing a story out of Northwest Ohio at a paper I used to work at where a local beryllium plant led into a Pulitzer finalist series showing basically ways in which the U.S. Military poisoned a generation of workers who were working in weapons plants during the Cold War. Mm-hmm. It starts at a local story and then you find the larger scale. I have to say, for commercial for-profit media, those stories are at the local level are just going to get harder and harder to do. I have nothing but praise and applause for the folks that will continue to do them. But in a lot of cases, it's going to need to be local independent nonprofit news organizations that are devoted to investigative reporting that a number of communities around the country have or are lucky to have. They're going to play a larger role in it.
But can a community newspaper, even in a nonprofit capacity, because I've often thought about, could a local newspaper that operated as a nonprofit, could it continue to thrive in that capacity? Because as you well pointed out, publishers were in the business of making money and they made a lot of money.
Yes.
And they're not making that money now, but in a nonprofit sense, can they continue to thrive?
There are certainly ways in which it is easier in that there are a variety of, there are grants that are available to you that aren't if you're a for-profit. The fact that you shift to being for-profit to nonprofit means that you are mission-driven in a way that a newspaper is somewhat mission-driven, but not entirely mission-driven. And there are a number of experiments going on with that. The Philadelphia Inquirer was a for-profit company, and Philadelphia Daily News. It was last year donated to a nonprofit, so it now has nonprofit management, and they're going to be trying a number of things to try and innovate and maintain the important work that they did while they're managing the decline of print. So I'm hopeful. My main concern, though, is that those are very irregularly distributed. There are, let's say 100 of those sites across the country of varying sizes. It's great that we have a ProPublica and a Center for Public Integrity and a Center for Investigative Reporting that are nonprofits that do amazing work, but there aren't enough of them.
What are the, let's look at the for-profit world. Are you seeing anything, hearing anything coming out of Amazon, Washington Post that they might be trying in terms of marketing news that might be successful, for example?
Well, the Post, Jeff Bezos knows how to run a digital company. He's quite good at that. The Post has been a remarkable turnaround success story. They've achieved enormous reach with audience. They have shifted from managing decline every year and figuring out how many people they have to lay off to investing in bringing in more reporters, more engineers. Essentially, the way he frames it to the Post is, I give you runway. You don't have to be hitting a quarterly returns number anymore. I give you some time to figure this out. And I do think there's actually a potential. I don't have any inside knowledge on this, but you would think if anyone is interested in an industry that involves last mile delivery to homes, it might be Amazon. Newspapers do exactly that. That's the core sort of physical asset that they have. The Washington Post has created marketing partnerships with over 300 American newspapers, where if you get a digital subscription to the Dallas Morning News, you get a digital subscription to the Washington Post for free. There's no money changing hands, but it has meant that the Washington Post has this broader reach that it would not otherwise. And then on top of that, you have the fact that if you're an Amazon Prime user, you can get a subscription to the Washington Post, quite cheaply. You can imagine a number of ways that you could see what was initially just a Washington play turning into a national play that, if it's done correctly, could support a lot of local newsrooms. The New York Times does wonderful work, but they're not really interested in that. They're much more interested in global expansion. They've launched an edition in Spanish and launching a special section for Australia and Canada. They see their future growth among the sort of educated English-speaking tier of the rest of the world. The Washington Post is, I think, a better hope for local journalism in the U.S.
When you get down to it, I mean, this course is about journalism under siege, and being under siege, how does that threaten democracy? What I'm seeing here scares the hell out of me about where our country is headed, because, as you pointed out so well, the journalism profession is important to a democracy, key to a democracy. And we're seeing that key basically go flat. And I worry where this is going to take us as a nation, frankly. I try to continue to be optimistic, and I am about the business, but I'm worried, especially after seeing this.
I do think that there's a sense in which we in the United States were really lucky in the 20th century, that our journalism and our media ecosystems mirrored our political systems. We had local cities who had mayors and city councils, and for every mayor there was a newspaper to watch that mayor and to watch that city council. We had a geographic distribution which sort of mirrored our federalist system. And that is all being pushed out to the national level. I don't worry about coverage of the federal government. I don't worry about coverage of the next election. There's plenty of talent and plenty of resources who are tackling those issues. But as we've discussed, it takes a strong and vibrant local news media to both provide the important accountability role that journalism does in making sure that politicians aren't stealing money, that businesses aren't getting sweet deals, all the things that good journalism does, but also that you have a media ecosystem that reflects the people of America outside of I-95 on the East Coast. I mean, one reason why you have an issue with trust in media is that if you live in Rain, Louisiana or Colorado Springs and you see the New York Times or the Washington Post or CNN, even though these are wonderful institutions that do a lot of tremendous work, they're not your neighbors. Your local newspaper is your neighbor, and you know those people for an extended period of time. And I like you, worry about the loss of that connection and the way that fuels the kind of mistrust we've seen.
Well, how do we turn that around then on a local level? Dean Kelly's from a small town, Perry, Oklahoma. I'm from a town not far away from that, Ponca City. Longtime publishers and editors who have spent decades publishing those newspapers, and once they're gone, those newspapers probably won't exist until another solution is found, and that's what we're all groping for in the dark, is a solution like that. I mean, in my hometown, without a local, I believe, and I think Dean Kelly can speak to this as well later, but I believe that Ponca City News was the glue that held the community together, and once you lose that glue, I don't see the community being bound together by Facebook unless Facebook decides to get on a local micro-journalism level, or people in those communities can utilize social media to pick up the slack and tell the stories in a sense. But I don't know.
There's actually a lot of interesting research about the settlement of the American West and the degree to which the success of a given town on the train line or on the stagecoach line was to a significant degree driven by the strength of the newspaper. In other words, if it had a strong newspaper that had a significant readership, the town grew up around it. So I completely agree there's a significant role for local media to play there. I would say if the kind of people who are in this auditorium or the kind of people who are watching this on OU TV are people who are civically engaged, who care about their communities. And I think everyone who fits that description has been given the capacity to reach an audience, to have a voice in social media on other platforms. And I think we all have to recognize that we have to pick up the slack. I will say in my hometown of Rayne, we have a twice weekly newspaper, and I'm glad they're still around and still kicking. But there's also a Facebook group that is dedicated to my town, that has more members than the town has residents. It has a lot of people who've moved away. And there are people in there who go to every city council meeting and say exactly what happened over every issue. And there's this question about this zoning regulation on this liquor store on the west side of town, and they don't like that. And there is a pretty boisterous civic conversation going on from that group of people who were the gadflies who showed up at the city council meetings, but who didn't necessarily have a way to put that out there. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I live, there's a neighborhood listserv where every debate about every development project in the neighborhood is vociferously debated, sometimes to an unreasonable degree. That sort of environment, I think we're going to, for better or worse, be reliant on engaged citizens to do some of that work.
But can you make money as a journalist, doing that? I see a ray of hope here because people want information about their communities. And of course, jobs in legacy media are declining, but looking at the job market, this job market seems to be good right now for journalists coming out of college, somewhat. I mean, but going to different sorts of companies. Is that true, or am I just dreaming this?
I don't know how, if it's, I would.
It feels that way to me right now.
That far. I would say that you've seen the maturation of digital outlets who are hiring at slightly greater scale now. Again, unfortunately, very concentrated in places like New York and DC. And you haven't seen, layoffs are still happening to roughly the same degree at newspapers that they have been, but they're often happening in such a way that they are hiring in people with more digital skills to replace them. So there are opportunities, and there will be opportunities for people with passion and interest, but it's not going to be the good old days that we
Well, and I want to say that I think what you said with passion, what I'm seeing, particularly in students that I work with, is a mission that's there that seemingly was there when I was growing up as well. It's a different, their mindset is mission driven toward finding solutions and being part of the media landscape in that respect. So to me, that's where there's optimism, is that they're not being trained just to be in one medium or the other. They're being trained these days, or they're training themselves to be in various different types of mediums and operate and understand what the importance of data and data analytics and things like that are, and thus increase their ability to be hired in this world. And, I think we can look at it as the democracy is doomed, but I think as long as we have journalists that I see that are growing up into understanding the culture and understanding what they have to do to survive in the culture, that I don't think we're doomed.
Well, thank you for this great conversation. I want to thank our audience in Oklahoma on cable for tuning into this Presidential Dream Course series. As always, I want to thank President David Bourne for providing the funding for this class. Don't despair. We're going to find a way, I promise. Thank you very much and good evening.